Hello, everyone. My name is Elisa Levet, and I'm a developer advocate engineer here at Zoom. In this video, I'm going to talk about one of the querying tips that I've come across when working with the Zoom Meeting API. And I will be breaking down the difference between a meeting ID and a meeting UUID, and I'm going to talk about when it's best to use each in your API queries. So let's jump right in. We're going to talk about the main differences between a meeting ID and a meeting UUID. The meeting ID is the meeting number associated with a schedule or instant meeting. And meeting IDs can be a 10 or an 11-digit number. Normally, the 11-digit number is used for instant, scheduled, or recurring meetings. And the 10-digit number is used for the personal meeting ID, that it's a personal and permanent meeting room associated with your account that you can start at any time or also schedule for a future use. So the meeting UUID, it is a universal unique identifier associated with a meeting. So these are generated upon meeting creation. One of the main differences between a meeting ID and a meeting UUID is that the meeting UUID contains a combination of letters, numbers, and special characters, whereas the meeting ID consists of numbers only. So to summarize, a meeting ID is the meeting number and a meeting UUID is an instance of a meeting. So you can have a meeting ID with multiple meeting UUIDs, but a single meeting UUID can only belong to one meeting. Let's move on and do some testing with our endpoints. Now, I am going to show you some requests that I've made to the Zoom Meeting API with using meeting IDs and meeting UUIDs. The point of showing you this request is so we can identify together when to use a meeting ID and when to use a meeting UUID. So the first use case that comes to my head is if you want to query general data of a meeting, you can use your meeting ID, right? So let's make a call to the get a meeting endpoint. And I have my request here ready in Postman. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to get a meeting and I already know the meeting ID. So I'm just going to send my request and you're going to see that in your response, we're going to get some general data related to the meeting, such as the UUID, the host ID, the join URL, some settings of the meeting, etc. Now, when you don't know the meeting UUID for a specific instance, we offer an endpoint that will help you identify different instances of a meeting. So in this use case, you're also going to need the meeting ID. So for example, if we want to know if the meeting that we were querying has meeting UUID associated with it, what we're going to do is that we're just going to call the get past meeting instances of this meeting. So I'm just going to change my request URL here. I'm going to past meeting and also instances. Let's see. As you can see, the response for this API call is empty. Why? Probably because this meeting hasn't been started yet. So our response, it's an empty array of meeting instances. This means there are no instances associated with the meeting and the meeting has not been started yet. Here's another example of another meeting which has more instances. So see that using the meeting ID, you're grabbing 4 different UUIDs that are all associated to the same meeting. So all these instances, all these meeting UUIDs belong to the same meeting up here. So when do I use a meeting UUID? When you want to get specific data of an instance. So let's say we want to get some data from this instance, from this meeting instance right here, and we're going to make a call to the metrics endpoint, and we just want to query the participants of the meeting. So instead of passing a meeting ID in our request URL, we're going to pass the meeting UUID. Why? Because we really need information about this specific instance. So let's send this request. And as you can see, I am getting some data back from this API call. If I don't pass the meeting UUID and I just passed the meeting ID, let's see the difference. what's going to happen is that it's going to return some data to me, but this will be the latest instance of the meeting, right? So it will be the meeting instance that happened on this date at 4:45. So it is this instance right here. It is the latest instance of the meeting. But if you want to know specific data from a specific instance, we need to pass the meeting UUID. See how the time has changed. Some of the tips when calling the Zoom meeting API, it's always important to remember that if a meeting was held only once, you can always use the meeting ID to query any endpoint. If a meeting was held more than once, you can always call the list past meeting instances endpoint to get a list of the meeting UUIDs associated with that meeting. And that way you will be able to query each specific meeting UUID. Use the meeting UUID to query each individual instance of a meeting. Remember to double encode the meeting UUID if it starts with a slash or contain any double slash to avoid getting an error. This is noted in our documentation. Also, these rules apply to webinars. A webinar ID and a webinar UUID will be generated upon webinar creation. A new webinar UUID will be generated for future webinar instances. Thank you so much for following along, and happy coding.